There are many myths about Jesus. In these programs, we're exploring the facts behind the myths. We've seen that the accounts in the Bible give us a reliable picture of Jesus, based on the testimony of people who saw and heard him. What kind of picture? The central claim of the Christian message is that Jesus is the Son of God. The myth is that he was just a teacher or prophet, whose followers turned him into the Son of God many years later. So what does the evidence say?
I think it's difficult on the basis of an appropriately critical handling of the gospel text. I think it's difficult to ascribe that kind of direct claim or direct authentication to Jesus himself.
It was indirect. Jesus didn't come into Palestine and into this world saying, "I am God, look at me," in that sort of direct way. Had he done so, he would have been stoned and it wouldn't have been accepted. Jesus came into the world in a very humble way.
During Jesus' own ministry, clearly, as I say, he did become the issue. And the question of his validity, the question of whether he was really the spokesman for God, whether he really brought the truth about God was clearly an issue. But I don't see any indication that during his own ministry, his disciples were inclined to offer him worship, for example, in the way in which they did so readily after Jesus' death and resurrection.
Virtually everything that he did pointed to his uniqueness. He claimed to forgive sins. That's something only God does. He cleanses the temple. That's an authority that is left on the most sacred spot on the earth to God. He claims to be Lord of the Sabbath. That's a commandment that God gives that pictures the creation. He changes the liturgy of the Passover to refer to himself. Who has the right to change liturgy like that? He calms the waves like God. Virtually everything Jesus does points to his uniqueness.
As Jesus ministered, as he spoke with extraordinary authority. And people were saying, where has he got this authority from? And he would talk about the Old Testament and the Old Testament teaching, and then he would say, but I say to you, as though he had authority which was, in a sense, comparable with the authority of God who'd spoken through the Old Testament. And then when people were brought to him, he had enormous power as a healer and an exorcist. And he didn't just heal people, but he also said highly controversial things. He said to one man who was brought to him, "Your sins are forgiven you." And the religious observers said, how can he say this? Nobody can forgive sins but God alone. And Jesus acted with this sort of divine authority in a way that really struck people. Some people objected to it, and people like Paul end up trying to persecute Jesus. Others recognized that actually, yes, indeed, God had come into the world through this wonderful person, Jesus.
The early Christians are quite free about saying that it was God's authentication of Jesus rather than Jesus' authentication of himself that drove them. And that primary authentication of Jesus happens through the experience of Jesus' resurrection and the conviction that God is exalted into heavenly glory. And on the basis of that divine action, they feel compelled to do it.
The one category he will not allow you to have him park in is the category people who want to make a cultural Jesus want to put him in, and that is to leave him as a prophet. In fact, even the confession of Peter at Caesarea Philippi contrasts, who do people say that I am? And there's prophetic categories. With who do you say that I am? Or who do you say the Son of Man is? And Peter answers, you are the Christ. The moment you make Jesus the Christ, you put him in the center of the program of God that's saving people, and you put him in a unique position. So the one option you have, I say this to people, if you're going to think about Jesus, either say he's not who he claims to be, or recognize that he is the Messiah, Son of God, and is unique. The one category he won't let you keep him in is he's merely a prophet. He's one among many.
The myth is that Jesus was just a prophet or teacher. The fact is that in all kinds of ways, he himself claimed that he was more than that he had a unique relationship with God.